Okay, hi. Let's check if we're live. Hi. Is the sound working? Okay, perfect. Hi, good morning. I'm Kallina. We're going to be looking at the closing half for British Parliamentary. Thank you very much for inviting me for this. So I can't hear what's happening in the room, but Angelus is going to be relaying your questions back to me in writing so we can address them throughout the session. I want to look at closing half for the next 4 to 5 minutes or so. We're going to look a bit at different types of extensions, how to prepare for closing half in particular, and how that's different from preparing for opening half in a BP debate. Briefly look at contradictions and knifing and how to deal with these situations. A bit of the role of the whip speaker, and if we have time, how to use POIs from the closing half to your advantage in the debate. The different sections, if you have questions as we go through, just give them to Aigelos and we can answer them as we go along. But if you have, we can also have some general questions at the end. So first of all, just an important disclaimer for everything in closing half and for everything I'm going to say. There is not one single way to do closing half debate. It's a very, to do the positions. It's a very strategic position in the debate, and it depends a lot on what the opening half teams have done. So you need to learn how to read the debate and make a call in the debate about what's going to be the most useful, what's going to help you win the round and get the most point out of it. So some of the things I'm going to say in this debate or in this lecture are going to be applicable and will help you win debates from the closing half. Sometimes some of these things won't help because it depends on how the debate has gone. The same with any strategic choice you make in a debate. It depends on the context of how the round is going. First of all, like very basic, the two speakers in the closing half, the role of both speakers, the role of the member is effectively to engage with the rest of the debate and extend the debate. We'll talk in a second about extensions and what they are. The role of the whip speaker is to engage again with the debate. Quite important that it's not just a conclusion of the debate, but also involves engagement and to conclude the debate. Not to summarize, but to conclude. We'll talk about this again a bit later. So what are the different types of extensions? So there, often you hear from, you might hear from judges that you need to extend, you need to add to the debate. Basically from the closing half, what you're trying to do is not only beat the teams that are on the other side of the bench, but also the team that is in the opening half of your side, which at the beginning especially is a bit counterintuitive because you're arguing for the same thing, you're on the same side, and you need to maintain consistency. So how do you engage? How do you extend in a debate? There are a few different things that you can do and different types of extensions that you can have. The first and most obvious thing is that you can add an entire area to the debate. It could be a new stakeholder that hasn't been discussed before, or a type of impact. Let's say that they were discussing if the debate was about, for example, prisoners raising children behind bars. If they haven't talked about children, you could be talking about the children as a new stakeholder. This is unlikely though, right? This is quite rare that especially the main stakeholders or the main types of impacts in a debate haven't been discussed by the opening half, but obviously if they haven't, you need to bring them into the debate, and this would be a very strong new extension for the debate. But as I said, this is rare because usually the most important areas and stakeholders or impacts will be at least touched upon by the opening half teams if they're doing their job properly. The second type of extension you can have, which is similar, is that you don't necessarily add an entire new area to the debate, but you add a new argument to the debate. So even though, for example, children may have been discussed in the opening half in a debate about raising them in prison, maybe specific impacts that have to do, let's say, with their education rather than their socialization haven't been discussed. So you can add that as a type of impact or argument in the debate. This is more common that this happens because even though the opening teams may have identified correctly the key stakeholders in the debate, maybe they haven't had enough time to go into it in as much depth and with enough detail to cover all the different types of arguments that can be made about the stakeholders. So this is a second type of extension, is adding an argument to an existing area of the debate. The third type of extension, which is more common, especially when the opening half teams have done their job quite well and they have identified all the stakeholders, they've made a lot of the arguments that you expect to make the debate, is not necessarily to add a new area or a new argument, but to add depth to arguments and ideas that are already in the debate. This is quite an important one, especially when having a strong team in the opening. What often is missing, and we'll talk about this a bit in how to prepare for the closing half as well, what's often missing is that the opening teams in their attempt to cover as much ground as possible in the debate and talk about all the key issues in the debate don't necessarily have the time to go in enough detail about how these arguments work and show exactly the mechanisms behind the arguments. So if the opening team has made what is effectively an assertion and said, look, raising kids behind bars makes, or let's say it's an opposition and says that this has an impact on the socialization of the child, maybe they've made a general impact about, a general point and claim about how this is going to affect the upbringing of the child, but it doesn't mean that they've gone in enough depth in explaining exactly how the child is going to behave, exactly how those around them are going to behave, and the different ways in which this is going to work. Or very often what this comes down to is explaining, people make claims about how people are going to behave without necessarily explaining why they're going to behave in a certain way, how incentive structures work for them to behave in that way. So very often a good extension is taking a claim that was made by the opening team and actually substantiating that claim by explaining incentive mechanisms and explaining how things work and why they work in the way that the opening team has claimed. So quite important here is when you're trying to identify the extension in the debate, when the opening team is speaking, don't immediately tick off things that they've mentioned in the debate. Make sure that you listen and you pay attention as to whether they're actually proving the things that they're claiming rather than just asserting them or making a lot of statements about them. Just because someone is saying that they have 5 mechanisms for something, which is becoming quite common for people to have an argument and then a lot of mechanisms underneath, it doesn't mean that they're actually explaining any of them in any particular depth. So it gives you an opportunity to take that away from them and make the argument. I'm stressing this third way of doing extensions in terms of adding depth to arguments more than the other two, because I actually think it's more likely that in strong debates, this is going to be the one where you can find a truly winning extension and you can find new content in the debate. Something to note about about extensions. What you add as a third speaker and as a web speaker is not just the extension and something that you flag as this is my new argument or my new point, but to some extent rebuttal as well counts as part of your extension. If you add depth and content and different responses to arguments that have been made by the opening teams or the previous speaker, that also counts towards your new contribution in the debate. The most important thing, and this is what all of these different types of extensions come down to, is being able to show why what you're saying and what you're adding in the debate is more significant than what has been contributed by the opening half. So if they talked about, and this is actually what helps you choose which type of extension is appropriate in each debate. So if the opening half talked about what you consider to be the 2 or 3 key stakeholders in a debate, but you have a fourth stakeholder, a third or a fourth stakeholder, which you yourself know is not that important in the debate, maybe it's worth mentioning, but it's unlikely that you're going to be able to show that this stakeholder is more important than the contribution made by opening half. This is fine. It just means that you're going to be credited with having an extension, but you're unlikely to be able to be placed because of that extension higher than the opening team on your side. If the opening team on your side has missed significant analysis or asserted significant analysis about a key impact in the debate, then it's more likely that adding to that will help progress the debate and will help you claim not only that you're making a contribution to the debate, but that that contribution is a significant contribution in order for the judges to place you over the opening team on your side. So these are very briefly the 3 different types of extensions that you can have and how to choose between the 3. As I said, again, it depends on what the opening team has done, it depends on the motion, and it depends on the ideas that you had coming into the debate from prep. So before I move on to prep, do we have any questions about the type of extensions, or should I move on? Okay, I'll move on to the different types of to how to prepare for the closing half, and we can come back to questions about it, about the types of extensions. So how to prepare for the closing half, and here's something just because it's quite different from the opening half. In the opening half, when you're in opening government or opening opposition, you have the prep time in order to actually come into the debate basically with speeches that you are ready to deliver, especially for the first speaker, maybe not for the second speaker, but by the time you come into the room, the first speaker should be ready to deliver a full speech. This means that in the opening half, you necessarily need to spend some time constructing the speeches and having a structure, even working on things like phrasing, which can be quite useful for the opening half teams. For the closing half, this is completely unnecessary. You don't need to write down anything in prep that resembles a speech because you don't know what the speech is going to look like until the opening teams have spoken. So it's a different kind of prep. This gives you actually the luxury of time. This means that 15 minutes can be spent having a discussion about the issues in the debate and gaining a deeper understanding of what happens without the pressure of writing speeches. There are 2 different things that I suggest you try to do during prep in closing half. It's all about brainstorming. As I said, it's not about writing speeches. The first thing you want to do, sort of a broad brainstorming. You want to cover have as much variety as you can with your partner. So cover as many areas in the debate, not just the obvious ones. Okay, there are some things that the moment we read the motion, within a few minutes you have some obvious stakeholders, some obvious impacts. You should write those down as well, because it doesn't mean that the opening team is going to discuss them, but you want to go broader than that. You want to think whether there are different approaches or different issues you can bring in the debate that perhaps are not as intuitively linked to the motion, and maybe the opening team is not going to think about them and have time to, or even if they think about them, they're not going to have time to explore them in the 15 minutes with the pressure of also setting up the first speeches. So you want to go as broad as possible and cover as much different ground as you can with different ideas. But again, as I said, write down the obvious ones as well, because maybe what is obvious to you is not going to be obvious to the opening team in that particular debate. But go broad. So the first type of brainstorming is broad for variety. The second thing you want to do and use your time for is go deep, have deep brainstorming, where you work essentially on analytical depth. Take even the obvious ideas and take especially the key ideas in the debate and think about different mechanisms that you can use to explain this argument and how it works. Ideally, you would be able to come up with multiple mechanisms of explaining the particular argument. This means that even if the opening teams give a specific explanation for an argument, given that hopefully if you're having a good debate with a lot of engagement, the opening opposition team or the opening government team, if you're in opposition, is going to attack that first mechanism. Having thought of deeper mechanisms or more different mechanisms and incentive structures, for example, for how people behave before coming into the debate means that by the time the opening team has given one, firstly, you have the opportunity of extending on that and using that as part of your extension, your constructive extension in the debate. But secondly, and perhaps more importantly, if that first mechanism has been attacked by the team on the other side, by the time you get to speak, you have other mechanisms to back it up with. You don't have to come up with things on the spot, but you actually have thought of a wider variety of ways of explaining the argument. Okay, so make sure that you spend some time, especially on the important parts of the debate, to look at why are people going to behave the way that we are claiming they're going to behave? Are there multiple ways in which I can explain why they're going to behave in this particular way to make it plausible? This gives you an advantage compared to the opening teams in terms of the analysis. So in terms of prep, make sure that by the end of it, you don't have ready-made arguments, but you do have several broad areas in the debate, all of them with different mechanisms and different ways of explaining them so that you have a lot of stuff to use going into the debate. The third speaker's notes going into the debate shouldn't look anything like a speech, but you should have enough different things, and including examples or anything else you want to bring in that you can use and essentially figure out during the process of the debate what you're going to do with it. But it gives you the materials you need, the tools you need to deal with whatever the opening team does. So this is the basic difference in terms of preparing for the opening and the closing half in the debate. I'll check if there are any questions about this, because this is basically the idea of how to prepare. It's quite straightforward. It's 15 minutes. I'm guessing we don't have any questions about this in particular. Okay, cool. In which case, let's go to the question of, where are we? So contradictions and knifing. Hold on. Okay, no questions. So contradictions and knifing. I'm not sure if you're all familiar with the idea of knifing. This is the point about whether the closing half team can contradict or disagree with the opening team on their side. It's called a lot of different things. Knifing is the most common, backstabbing, anything else. One of the issues often faced by closing half teams, especially because you don't know what the opening half team is going to do on your side coming into the debate, is that you might have a slightly different reading of the debate. If you have a slightly different reading of the debate, that's not much of an issue. The bigger problem arises if you have a very different understanding of the debate, especially if they say things that you don't agree with and things that you think work against your own side. In these cases, you are in a bit of a difficult position. This doesn't happen often, but it's hard to manage sometimes from closing when you find yourself in that position. It's quite tempting to disagree with the opening team, drop the opening team and say, nope, what they were saying was wrong. I don't care. I have a different reading of the debate. Don't do that. There are, again, as I said, there might be a circumstance where you decide this is the clever and, given the circumstances, best thing to do for you strategically, but this is quite rare, especially, and this is worth checking before every tournament, what kind of rules they're using, but especially at the moment, the guidelines for judging seem to be that when it comes to contradictions, the one that the judges, the statement that the judges are supposed to take into account is the first statement made. So if the opening team made a point, and which was quite a bad point, a very weak point, but they made that argument, if you come up in the second half and make an argument which is really strong, really interesting, but contradicts directly what the opening team has said, unfortunately, the judges, in theory, will be instructed to disregard that statement entirely, which means that even if your point was much better than the opening team's point, and it was instinctively a good thing to do to contradict them, in terms of the debate, you're not going to be getting credit for it. Sometimes you will be actively penalized for it, but even if you're not penalized for it, just the fact that that content is being disregarded means that if your extension, say, was completely in contradiction to the point made by the opening half team on your side, it means that effectively it's the same thing as not having made an extension in the first place. As I said from the beginning, I can't give you an absolute answer as to whether this is always a good or a bad idea. Sometimes it might be your best choice in the debate, but ultimately, especially with the guidelines given to judges since Euros this year in Warsaw, the idea is that the trend is towards judges disregarding the contradictory statement made, so the second statement made. This means that in the second half, it's never a particularly good idea to contradict. There is one way to sometimes get around tensions, not obvious contradictions, not the opening team saying this is going to be fantastic and you saying this is going to be horrible, but some milder tensions within a debate you can get around with what are possibly my two favorite words in a debate. And that's starting the sentence with even if. So even if the opposition is right about their attack, here is an alternative way of seeing this. Even if means that I still agree and I still stand by my original statement, whether it was mine, my partner's, or the opening team's statement, I still stand by the fact that this is true. But even if I give the other side the benefit of the doubt that this might not be true, here are other ways in which they still lose this debate. So there are ways in which you can package something that is in slight tension to the opening to actually make it seem in the debate that it's not contradictory, or you're not taking a stance that is openly in conflict with the opening team on your side. I'm giving this more time than it really deserves, because often it's quite rare that you're going to need to explicitly contradict the opening team, or that you're going to feel that this is important in the debate. Just remember, whenever you feel like you disagree with something that the opening team has done, remember whether it's worth the cost of finding yourself in tension with them and potentially being penalized for it, or whether it's actually better to stand by them and try to build in that on that statement and make it better. The third option you have is simply to distance yourself from it. So if it's in an area of the debate that you don't actually consider as strategically important in order to win the debate, perhaps there's no point in even engaging in the mess of an argument that you think is not particularly strong or you think is problematic, and kind of trying to sidestep that issue and avoid that discussion so that you don't really have to support it either. Keep in mind, you shouldn't be contradicting your opening team. That's quite important. You're on the same side of the bench, but it doesn't mean that you have to fully back them up in every claim that they make. Okay, let's get the question on this one. Is it all right for a closing team to add anything to the definition or the model? Good question. No, it's not. It's a very simple answer. You should not be adding to the definition or the model from the closing half. This is something that the opening team has, and especially not even the opening team, only the opening speaker, the Prime Minister, should be defining the motion and setting up the model for how this is going to work. So the closing team shouldn't be really adding anything. First of all, it's not considered an extension. So adding something to the model or the definition isn't considered an extension. And it does create issues with the debate, because it means that you are significantly changing the debate, right? whenever you're defining, whether it's from the opening or whether you have the temptation to define from the closing, you need to ask yourself whether something significantly alters the debate that we're having, right? So if you're going to add something that's insignificant, there's no point in adding it. If you're going to add something that is significant, then it means that you're changing the debate, and hence it's not within your role in the closing team to change the debate in such a drastic way. You can deal with, if the opening team had a model or a definition that was weak and has been heavily attacked by the opposition, as I said, you can distance yourself from it without contradicting it, simply by saying, okay, you know, they've spent all of their time attacking the model and exactly how this is going to work. We're happy that things can be always improved upon, but ultimately they haven't necessarily spent time clashing with the arguments in the debate or the principle of the debate or all of the constructive benefits that we're bringing you from the government side, right? So you can try to sidestep the issue of a slightly weaker or incomplete definition or a model. I hope this addresses it, but just try to avoid adding anything to the definition or the model. This is just the Prime Minister's job and no one else is in the debate. I hope that addresses that. If you have more questions on the definition of the model, we can come back to it. The second question we have is, what challenges you most often have had in the closing half? What is the way to overcome them? Good question. For me, the most common challenge, especially at the beginning, is to learn to identify an extension and what is best to expand upon, to be honest, especially when faced with teams that cover a lot of ground. I think the most stressful thing is when you hear them saying a lot of things and you feel like you don't have much to add in the debate. I think that the two things that I find the most useful in order to overcome them are, firstly, as I said before, in terms of prep, making sure that in prep you spend time going as broad and as deep as possible. I think this always makes you have the sense that there are going to be things that you're going to have to contribute in the debate. But secondly, I think, and this is the most important thing for closing half, perhaps, and identifying extensions, learning to listen to the opening team very, very carefully. Again, learning to tell the difference between someone having stated something and someone having argued something. There's a difference with them saying that they are going to talk about something and talk about the benefits of something, but not necessarily spending time explaining why this is going to happen, what are the incentive structures that are going to make people behave in that particular way. So I think often the most challenging thing for me, at least, was to tell the difference when an opening team has actually made an argument and there's nothing for me substantial to add from the closing, versus when the opening team has simply made a statement about something and there's still quite a lot of ground to add. So if you learn how to listen to the opening team and tell the difference between the two, I think you're going to be in a very good place to deal with what's usually the most scary thing about closing half, which is feeling like you're not going to have an extension or something significant to add. Hopefully, if you have any other questions on this, we can come back to it. Let's see if we should move on to the next page. Okay. Let's go a little bit into the whip speech. I've been talking a lot about the extension, which is primarily the third speaker, and should come into the third speech as a new approach to the debate, a new contribution. But there's obviously quite a lot to be said about the role of the whip speaker, who can have a very strong impact in winning the debate and how it goes for your side. The first thing to say about a whip speech, which sometimes is often very wrongly for me referred to as a summary speech, is that it's not a summary. When we summarize something, we repeat the key things mentioned, and a summary means a condensed repetition of something, in very simple terms. A whip speech really shouldn't be a summary, because you don't need to repeat everything that was said. You don't need to go team by team and say the opening team told us this, the opening opposition team told us that, or you don't need to go speaker by speaker in repeating the points that they made. The reason for this is quite simple. The judge was in the room. They were hopefully paying attention. They were keeping notes. They know what happened in the debate in terms of the points of each speaker. So summarizing in the sense of repeating things doesn't really add anything to your team as a speech, right? They've already done that. They already are aware of the points that were being made. So if it's not a summary speech, what is it? Like the most common explanation, but I think it's actually quite accurate, the most simplest form of a web speech is a biased adjudication. Effectively, what you're trying to do is make it easy for the judges to see why you win the debate, okay? And when I say you win the debate, probably you want to be talking about your bench, so you're talking about the government side or the opposition side. But when I say you, I actually mean you and your partner in the closing half, right? So again, without contradicting the opening half, a whip speech is there to make sure that the judges see that it's you and your partner that win the debate, not the opening team on your side. What you're doing effectively, what you want to do in a whip speech is give the judges the tools in order to make your decision. Always their decision after the debate. Always remember that you're the last impression. As soon as these two whip speeches are done, you leave the room and the judges are left there with a panel discussing and trying to decide the debate. Sometimes it might be obvious, but most often than not, it's not. So what a good whip speaker does is give the judges a very clear roadmap of how they need to decide the debate. So what does this mean? This means that effectively you've told them that at the end of this debate, at the end of this 1 hour discussion, this all comes down to 1, 2, 3 key issues in the debate, and here's how our side and how my teammate wins this debate. Okay, this is effectively what a whip speech should do. This means that, as I said before, it shouldn't be based on speaker by speaker or team by team. I think the most effective way, and you can do this, you can structure it in different ways, but the most effective way to approach a whip speech is to think about the issues that were discussed in this debate, rather than who discussed them specifically. The key themes in a debate, whether they're stakeholders or impacts, the key issues in a debate are going to be discussed by multiple speakers. They may have been introduced by the opening half. Still, for sure, the other side of the house is going to have rebuttal to these points if they don't have constructive points of their own. So there's been engagement about these issues and possibly extensions on these issues by the closing half. So instead of going speaker by speaker, which is actually going to make your speech repetitive, it's probably best to identify these key areas as issues and show the judges how all of this discussion, from the opening, from rebuttals, from constructive points, how all of this falls into place into one issue, and how at the end of that discussion that issue falls on your side. The ideal thing to do here is to use your partner's speech, use the extension speech, the member speech, to show how the content and the ideas that were first introduced by your partner make it show that that particular issue or the more important issues fall on your side. So if your partner introduced the analytical depth to an argument, you can say, look, the opening team introduced the idea of this stakeholder. My partner showed you why this stakeholder, who is the most important one in this debate, why this stakeholder is going to behave in the ways that we want them to behave. So this is how, or we are claiming they're going to behave. So this is how you can bring it back to your partner, and referencing your partner's approach to the debate should be something that is a running theme throughout the whip speech. There are very different ways, people do it in different ways, so there's no one way to do this. I actually think that it's probably best if you experiment with different ways of doing whip speeches, but always, until you find the one that works best for you, but always remember that what you're trying to do is guide the judge's discussion after you've left the room into a discussion that clearly favors your side and your team in that debate. Okay, so if you can make your partner's points and contributions seem like the ones that are the most significant ones in the debate, that's when you've done your job as a whip. Sometimes that may mean that you structure your speech around 2 key areas. Sometimes you might want to ask questions and answer the questions. Sometimes there's going to be more than 2 in a debate. It really depends on how the debate has progressed, but you need to listen and figure out the way that makes your partner stand out as the most important contribution in the debate, and why that was the most important contribution in the debate. Again, so that you can beat the other side, but you can also beat the opening side, the opening team on your side. Quite important, and it's a bit tempting sometimes to go all the way to the other extreme, where you're not, you're giving so much weight to your partner that you're ignoring the rest of the debate or the opening half of the debate. You should acknowledge the opening half of the debate. It's part of the discussion. It shouldn't just be about the closing. The ideal thing to do is make sure that you, whenever you're talking about the opening half, that you always remember what your partner did in addition to the opening half, and remembering to say that, they gave you this one response to this point, which was great. Here are the other 3 responses that my partner also contributed to the debate, which are even more important because. So you're always trying to make a comparative with the opening side of the debate. But I think whip speeches are one that can be quite a lot of fun, but you need to make sure that you try and find your own way of doing it that is the most effective. So that's briefly about whip speeches. Do we have any questions on that? I'm going to say I was usually a third speaker rather than a whip, so my preference is for extensions, if that wasn't clear. I have a lot of admiration for great whip speakers. Okay, so let's look a little bit at how the 2 work together, because as I said, coming into the debate, in the opening half, your roles are a bit more defined. A lot of things have happened during prep. You've had your speeches, or at least the majority of the speeches written out before coming into the debate. In the closing half, you don't really have the luxury of that, and cooperation during the debate is incredibly important. There are just a couple of things that you need to keep in mind about how to work in the debate. The first thing is that you need to work together in terms of the extension. Identifying an extension in the debate is not exclusively the role of the third speaker. Many teams actually work in exactly the opposite way, that it's the whip speaker who identifies the extension rather than the third. The reason for that is that for the whip speaker to construct the summary, their speech in the ways that I discussed before, they need to have a very good overview of the debate. They need to have a great idea of a very good understanding of where the debate is going, the contributions that different teams make, and quite importantly, be able to assess the comparative strength of these contributions in this debate, in the debate that's happening. So it's quite common that the whip speaker is going to be one who has the ability to identify through that process, through the process of trying to come up with their own speech, is going to be able to identify how what are the main gaps in this debate, what's missing strategically, so they can point out to their extension speaker that, look, there is this huge gap in the debate that hasn't been discussed so far. You need to make sure that your extension also addresses this. So the first thing is that the whip speaker sometimes is actually the one who identifies the extension. But even if they don't identify the extension, I think this is entirely about team dynamics. Different teams work in different ways, and in different debates it works in different ways. But the whip speaker necessarily, even if they didn't identify the extension, they need to understand the extension and why it's important in the debate. Okay, so you need to make sure, if you're the third speaker, that you're checking with your whip whether they understand the extension and why it's important in the debate. Otherwise, you're going to make the speech, you're going to say really clever things as third, and then your partner is not going to be able to communicate to the judges why the things you added are that important in the debate. So we have a couple of questions. It's a challenge to listen to the debate and keep notes as an extension speaker. How do you do that effectively? That's an excellent question, which is the second thing about communication in the debate between the two speakers. So in terms of communication here, how do you try to come up with an extension, write the extension, and at the same time listen to what's happening? There's too much going on as a third. This is true. Multitasking is great in debates, but there is a limit to it. At some point, you are going to have, as a third speaker, to stop paying as much attention to the debate. Always try to keep an ear out for important things that may be happening, but you will at some point have to switch off. A little bit, well, not switch off, but definitely to zone out a little bit and work on your own extension. This is the point where the whip speaker becomes incredibly important in keeping track of what's happening while you're working on your own speech. Whether it's the listening to the, let's say you're closing government, listening to the opening opposition so that you can respond to the points and make sure that you nudge your partner and say, look, now this is important, you need to listen to it. Or whether it's listening to the second speaker of the opening half, if they're going dangerously close to the extension, and you think that the extension speakers should be aware of exactly what's being said. So the whip speaker needs to keep track of what's happening and tell their partner when they need to pay attention and what they need to pay attention to and what it might not be as important. Sometimes, and if you've worked with your partner and you've trained together for long enough, it even becomes possible for the whip speaker to even write down responses to arguments that you didn't really get to listen to in the debate and for you to rebut them through your partner's notes. But I think that takes more fine tuning in a team to be able to do. But it's quite important. There's no it's unrealistic to expect that an extension speaker is actually going to keep track of everything in the debate. That's why the whip speaker is incredibly important in that partnership. I'm going to come back to, there's another question here about during prep. I'm not sure if that means for notes, but if you can clarify that question, because it says it also during prep, and I'll come back to it. The other question we have is, what's your preferred method communicating with your partner during the debate? Maybe with different methods seen used. Okay, the obvious ones, the two obvious things are talking to each other and writing things down. Again, I think it depends on the team. Some teams understand each other better when they talk to each other. Some teams are better at writing things down. I generally have a preference for key things to be written down, because I think that even if you don't have the time to pay attention to a point made by your partner when they're making it, so they might want to tell you something or give you a good rebuttal or point something out, but if you're in the process of writing your own speech at that point, maybe you can't pay full attention to them. So I think for learning how to communicate in writing is probably the most effective thing, because you have the note, it stays there, and you can look at it at the point where you can actually spare the time to look at the note made by your partner. So I think the best way is to have to learn how to communicate in writing. It also forces you to be a bit more clear and concise with the point you're giving to your partner. Whereas when we start talking to each other, it's very easy to start rambling about things without being as clear. But obviously communicating verbally as well is fine, so long as you make sure it's done quietly and doesn't interfere with others in the debate. But I think ultimately the most effective thing is to learn how to pass notes to each other, so that you actually have things written down and you don't interrupt each other's flow of thinking while it's happening. How do you keep notes for an extension during prep? I don't think you keep notes for the speech. I think just other people do it with diagrams, other people do it with lists of ideas. My notes have always been a mess of things written around in different parts of a page. I think so long as you make sure that you have very detailed notes, whether it's in a diagram, whether it's in a list or anything else, just make sure that you have everything written down coming into the debate. That means that when you start, you're not going to speak from the notes you had in prep. this is just like a basic thing to remember. You're never going to deliver a third speech or a whip speech from the notes you prepared during prep. It's always something that has to be written in the debate in order to take into account what happened so far in the debate. So any other form of note-taking is fine that helps you listen in the debate when you're listening to the opening team to start crossing things out or figuring out and circling the things that you think you can add to the debate, and then structure the actual notes that you're going to speak from. I don't think it's possible to have notes from prep that actually result into the speech itself directly without having been rewritten. So think of your notes from prep just as reminders of things that you can use when it actually comes to writing the speech in the debate itself. I'm not sure if that, I hope that addresses that question. If it doesn't, we're going to come back to it in a bit. Okay, just quite briefly, because I think this is important from the closing half, is very briefly to look at points of information and how to use them, because one thing is having the extension, bringing in significant material and showing in the web speech why that's comparatively more important than the rest of the debate, but you also need to use points of information in a slightly different way perhaps than the opening teams do. The first thing and obvious thing is that you want to get involved early in the debate. You don't want the judges to first hear from your team after more than half of the debate is over, right? If you're saying closing opposition, by the time you actually get to deliver a speech in the debate, we're more than halfway through. So if this is the first time that the judges see you getting involved with a debate, it almost feels as if it's too late. There's nothing in the rules that says it's too late. It just feels that you haven't played a significant role in that debate at the point where we haven't heard from you in quite some time. So make sure that you get involved early, from as soon as possible, with points of information, so that you are also part of the opening half discussion. Something important here, make sure that you do have POIs when you offer them, because it's quite likely that you will be accepted from the closing half. If you're in the closing half, you will be accepted by the opening half teams. Opening teams tend to accept points of information from the team that is on their diagonal, so from the closing team on the other side of the bench, because it's their only chance to engage with the closing half of the debate. By the way, as a note, if you're opening government or opening opposition, try to take a point of information from the closing teams in the debate, because that gives you an opportunity to hear what's going to happen, right? That's actually quite a useful way for the opening teams to indirectly create a discussion with a team that they're never going to have an opportunity to clash directly with. So do offer POIs, and in most debates, especially if the opening teams are following this advice, they will be accepting at least one point of information from the closing team. Quite important here, a few things that you can do with these POIs. One thing that you can try to do from the closing when offering a POI to the opening teams is to try to claim claim some content, especially obvious and important content in the debate, as yours before the opening team on your side has had a chance to make that point. So if you know that there is going to be a point that is central to this debate, you really expect the opening team on your side to make that argument. You don't think that there's any way they won't make it. Offering a POI about it before they've had a chance to make the point can be quite a good way to signal to the judges that it's your idea. So by the time they get up to speak from the opening team on your side, it basically sounds as if they're making an argument about your POI. So you've kind of claimed part of that content as an idea that comes from you. Okay, so you can make it sound as if some of the ideas in the debate were introduced by you through POIs, even before you've had a chance to have a speech in the debate. So this can be one of the things that you can use with the opening team to put yourself in a stronger position to have an extension and important contribution in the debate. What is very important here, though, and this is almost in contradiction to what I just said now, because I just said make points and claim points in the debate as your own, is to also make sure that you're not giving away your extension from the opening speeches. Because if you give away too much, or if you have a really interesting idea that you want to extend on and you discuss it in a point of information, it's quite likely that you're going to give the opening team on your side the opportunity to listen to that POI, and then if they really like the point, if it's truly a significant point in the debate, claim it as their own. Which means that at that point, you might find yourself in a position where you're actually losing your extension because you gave it away to the opening team on your side. So it's a very delicate balance. Sometimes you're going to get it right, sometimes you won't, but it's a trial and error thing. Make sure that you're getting your content out there, but at the same time that you're not giving away too much so that your extension doesn't get attacked too much. When you do ask a POI to the opening, make sure, and this is true of all POIs, but especially when you're going to speak after them, make sure that you listen to their answer. It's not just about getting the question out there, but the answer they give is going to have an impact on how you can discuss issues in the debate. So make sure that you listen to their answer carefully and and take that into account. So if you gave something away about an argument and they gave you a response to it, make sure that by the time you actually speak about this issue in the debate, you've taken into account their response and you are discussing it. You're showing why this response was insignificant, or you're responding to their response so that the argument progresses further. Asking a POI that you don't listen to the answer of doesn't really help anyone. Get in early, and if you're in the closing half, try to get involved with the opening half. If you're in the opening half, let the closing half get involved. It's your only chance to respond to them. So this is something that you want to have an opportunity to do through POIs. Let's check if there are any questions. Okay, we're getting questions. Okay, in any case, while we're getting some questions, I'm just going to say one brief note to conclude with that, is that, as I said, all of these things are things that can be recommendations in a debate for the closing half. You need to remember that it's a team whose role in the debate is completely defined by how the debate has progressed. Until you get into the room and see what the opening teams are doing, you don't have a speech, so you can't have a set approach to the debate. As I said, none of the things I said can be applied directly in one way. There's no one best way to do a closing speech, a closing half speeches. You need to learn how to read the debate and see what the opening teams are doing and learn how to adjust to it, because that's going to determine all of your strategic choices. It's going to determine what are the issues that you can extend on, what are the issues that you should extend on. It's going to determine whether the whip speaker stresses one point or a different point. So all of these things are going to be determined by listening to the other side, but also, and very importantly, listening to what your own side in the debate is doing. So at that point, make sure that with closing half, you're quite flexible and don't take anything as a golden rule in the closing half. The only golden rule is that you're trying to have an impact in the debate and make it a significant impact. Everything else is defined by what's happening in the debate. One question we have is, do you think it's useful to watch seminar speeches as training? Yes. Yes, but I think it's useful to take away a couple of key points from them and then make sure that you try to apply them. You can listen to people talking about debate for hours. There are endless things on YouTube that are really useful, but unless you take away a couple of key points from each and try to apply them and find your own way of doing it, there's nothing that seminars can teach you about it. Make sure that you take the points away and try to apply them through repetition and listen to the judges every time as to whether something worked or something that didn't work. Any seminar will give you advice on the things we've seen and the things we've tried, but it can't tell you the best way for you to do things in practice. I'm happy to send a few recommendations about really good seminars that are useful for training. I'll send them through to Agelo. Can you describe some ways in which other teams have different ways of doing a closing half than you do? So yeah, fair enough. To be honest, the things I told you about and the different ways of doing closing half are not exclusively things. They're definitely not exclusively what I do. I actually don't do a lot of these things. I've always found it easier for me, and that's a personal thing, to extend by adding depth to arguments rather than finding new areas in the debate. So from the 3 different ways I gave you about extensions, I've always been more partial. I've always preferred the depth one, because that's the one that works better for me, explaining incentives rather than having new creative approaches. A lot of far more creative speakers than me find it easier to add new areas to the debate and new arguments to the debate rather than simply building in the depth and adding mechanisms. So I think anything goes, so long as you make sure that what you're doing is making the debate progress further. That's the only thing for closing half that really matters. If the debate could have ended after the opening half without it being a significantly different debate, then it means that the closing half was nice, but not having enough of an impact in the debate. So if you use that as a guide, you're going to find what's stronger for you. As with any debate speech, there's no perfect way to do it. It depends on how it works for each person. Any practice methods you engage to train for closing half? Good question. Sorry. Wait, we had a... I'm not sure about one question here, which is watch whip speeches as training. I can find debates where I think that the whip speeches were very useful and very strong, and I can send you recommendations for that. I'd be happy to do that. Keep in mind, you can't watch closing half teams in isolation and understand whether they were good or bad. So if you're going to watch the web speech to see if it was a good web speech and learn from it, you need to watch the debates that happened before, because it's only a good web speech in the context of what happened before and how they're dealing with the different issues. So never watch closing half teams without having watched the opening half. It's not going to make enough sense as to why they were good or not good. Any practice methods you engage to train closing half? Yeah, I think even doing, you can even find debates of different levels and different qualities. You can even find them online and watch exclusively the opening half. I think this is quite an easy way to train for closing. Watch the opening half on video and then try to come up with an extension as to what you would have done in that position. That also gives you the opportunity to then compare with what the closing teams in the actual debate in the video did, and then contrast that to what you did in your own speech. I think you can do that by getting really strong debates as well, so that you can see what you would have done with the closing half without the pressure of actually being in that debate. So the one thing would be to try to extend in existing debates that you can find online. The second thing I would say is to work with your partner on brainstorming. The difference in prep and the difference in being able to come up with a lot of content and broad content in the 15 minutes is quite important. So you can do that just by taking motions and then doing a lot of brainstorming sessions in how you would come up with different issues. pushing yourself to come up with even more arguments than needed. So be as exhaustive as possible is something that's useful as a training. This is actually useful for opening half as well. Training for how to brainstorm with your partner and how to prep with your partners, something that's useful for both halves in the debate. But I think these are the two main practice things for me for the closing half, is trying to extend the existing debates, and secondly, trying to fine-tune your brainstorming so that you always go into the debate with as much content as possible, so that you never are left with no extension and nothing new to add to the debate. Honestly, the moment the pressure goes away, that you feel like you're not going to have an extension, the closing half is incredibly good fun in debates. So the more practice you do in that, the better. Let's see if there's anything else. Okay. It seems like that's the last question. If there's, I'll send recommendations for workshops and debates to IGLO. But other than that, thank you very much for having me and your time. Enjoy the rest of the day.